Okay, factory overhead is the third piece of our product costs, and it is probably the most difficult to understand. Factory overhead is every other cost from our manufacturing process except for direct materials and direct labor. Now remember, direct materials and direct labor, we have a paper trail. I have materials requisitions that tell me exactly how much material went to which jobs, and I have time tickets that tell me exactly how many hours were spent on which jobs. So it's very precise, very detailed, and I can trace every bit of my direct materials and direct labor. Now factory overhead is everything else. So I have indirect materials. It's those little things like the sandpaper or glue or paint that are used on the jobs, but it's too much trouble to try to detail all of that out. Indirect labor, all of those individuals that are involved in the manufacturing process but aren't specifically touching and completing those products. It's our supervisors or the janitorial staff that are making sure the place is clean and safe for our employees. We also have our utility bills that keep the factory working. We have depreciation on the factory equipment. Anything that produces a cost for the manufacturing department for that factory becomes a factory overhead cost or an expense of operating. So back to our Legend guitar example, we are going to assume that we have $4,600 of overhead during December, all right? And that's overhead is an expense. It's the expense of running our factory. Of that overhead, $500 are indirect materials, right? The sandpaper, the glue, the stains and the paints, the guitar strings. $2,000 of indirect labor, right? So supervisors, the maintenance staff. $900 of utilities and $1,200 of depreciation on our factory machinery. The $500 of those indirect materials, right, it tells us exactly what it is, $200 worth of glue, $300 worth of sandpaper. So our journal entry to get that recorded, there it is, there's factory overhead. Now factory overhead is an expense. As our expenses increase, we're going to debit that expense. So there's that debit to factory overhead expense. And there's a credit to everything else. There's a credit to my raw materials inventory. I've pulled $500 worth of raw materials out of my materials warehouse. So there's a credit. It shows it coming out of my materials inventory. And there's my wages payable, utilities payable, and there's my accumulated depreciation. All right, so instead of, for example, accumulated depreciation, if you remember back to financial accounting, the debit would go to depreciation expense, right? When we're dealing with factory expenses, all of those expenses go to factory overhead. We don't detail out those expenses as utilities expense or depreciation expense or salaries expense. If it's related to the factory, it goes into factory overhead expense. All right, so think of a factory overhead as an expense account. All right, so here is an example. Hatch Company incurred factory overhead costs as followed. We have some indirect materials, indirect labor, utilities, and depreciation. There could be all kinds of other things, insurance, property taxes, anything, again, anything related to maintaining that factory that are not direct materials and direct labor. So the journal entry to record the factory overhead, all of those costs, I know exactly what they are. I paid them out of my pocket. I'm going to add them all up. That's my overhead cost. All right, so total of that, I can't do that in my head. All right, so there's a debit to that factory overhead. My actual expenses are $8,300. So I'm going to debit that overhead account, increase that overhead expense, and there's the credit to all of the respective accounts that all of that came from. All right. For factory overhead, most of this information will be given to you. You will be given a list of the expenses, and you just have to know how to sort out what's direct materials, what's direct labor, and everything else is overhead, and make sure that all of those other expenses get debited to that factory overhead account. All right, well, I'll separate this. I'll make a separate video for allocating. That will take a bit longer.